What happens when a billionaire's love story becomes a public spectacle of betrayal? For Serafina Blackwood, her life was a fairy tale. Married to the magnetic and powerful Damien Blackwood, she had it all, a sprawling penthouse overlooking the city, a love that tabloids swooned over, and now a baby on the way. But one cold evening the fairy tale shattered. Damien, in a chilling whisper that froze her soul, refused to claim their child. He accused her of the ultimate betrayal. Now, at the most prestigious event of the year, the Bavulgari-sponsored Starlight Charity Gala, the truth will be exposed. A single DNA test live on stage holds the power to destroy lives, unravel dynasties, and reveal a secret so shocking no one will ever be the same. Stay with us as we uncover what really happened. The love story of Damien Blackwood and Serafina Valerius was the kind of modern myth that gossip columnists and hopeless romantics feast on. He was the heir to the Blackwood empire, a sprawling conglomerate of technology, real estate, and private equity, a man whose tailored suits cost more than most cars, and whose presence commanded silence in any room he entered. Damien wasn't just wealthy, he was power personified. His features were sharp, intelligent, a predator's handsome mask that concealed a relentless drive. Serafina, by contrast, was the art curator, with a spirit as vibrant as the canvases she appraised. She came from a world of academia and quiet passion, not boardrooms and hostile takeovers. They met at a Sotheby's auction, where Damien was bidding on a Rothko not for its investment potential, but because, as he told her later, the turbulent reds and somber purples reminded him of his own soul. Serafina had laughed a sound like wind chimes and challenged his self-assessment. He was captivated. Their courtship was a whirlwind of private jets to Paris for dinner, shutting down museums for private viewings, and stolen moments in the quiet gardens of his family's Long Island estate. Damien, a man notoriously private and emotionally guarded, seemed to unfurl in her presence. He traded his cynical smirk for a genuine smile. He listened. For the first time, the world saw Damien Blackwood not as a corporate shark, but as a man deeply in love. Their wedding was the event of the decade. Serafina, in a custom Vera Wang gown, looked ethereal. Damien, watching her walk down the aisle, had a tear trace a path down his chiseled cheek, a moment captured by Vogue that went viral, cementing their status as the world's most enviable couple. The first year of their marriage was idyllic. They lived in a penthouse that felt less like a home and more like a private cloud, with panoramic windows showcasing the city skyline as their personal art installation. Serafina softened Damien's steel edges, and he gave her a world of security and boundless opportunity she'd never dreamed of. The news of her pregnancy was the final perfect piece of their fairy tale. Damien was ecstatic. He held her in his arms, his face buried in her hair, whispering promises to their unborn child. He would build them a legacy, a world worthy of a Blackwood heir. The nursery was designed by a world-renowned architect, a miniature palace of soft creams and gentle blues. He commissioned a lullaby from a famous composer. He was, by all accounts, the perfect expectant father. The first crack in their perfect world was almost imperceptible. It started with the arrival of Isabella Blackwood, Damien's stepmother. A woman sculpted from ice and ambition, Isabella had married Damien's father, Sterling Blackwood, late in his life. She had a son of her own from a previous marriage, Julian. A smarmy, handsome man who always lingered in Damien's shadow. his eyes glinting with a covetous envy. Sterling had left the entire empire to Damien, his biological son, leaving Isabella and Julian with a generous but finite trust fund, a fact that Isabella had never forgiven. Isabella began to visit the penthouse more frequently, her presence a cloying perfume that lingered long after she left. She'd bring Serafina teas she claimed were for the baby's health and engage her in long, probing conversations, her questions veiled in a syrupy concern that set Serafina's teeth on edge. "You must be so thrilled, dear," Isabella said one afternoon, her perfectly manicured fingers stroking a porcelain teacup. "To give Damien what he's always wanted, a true heir, a continuation of the Blackwood bloodline. It's everything." The emphasis on bloodline was subtle, yet sharp as a pinprick. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening. The air was thick with the promise of a summer storm. Damien came home late, his usual warm greeting replaced by a stiff, unsettling silence. He didn't kiss her. He walked to the vast window, his back to her, and loosened his tie. "Is everything all right, my love?" Serafina asked, her hand instinctively going to her swollen belly. "I had a meeting with Isabella today," he said, his voice flat. "Oh, I hope she was pleasant." He turned, and the look on his face made the breath catch in her throat. The warmth was gone, replaced by a glacial fury she had only ever seen him direct at business rivals. "She showed me something, Serafina. Something I can't unsee. Damien, what are you talking about? You're scaring me." He strode over to the marble coffee table and threw a slim silver laptop down. He tapped the trackpad and an image filled the screen. It was a photo clearly taken with a long lens of Serafina having lunch on an outdoor patio. She was laughing, her head tilted back. Sitting across from her was Leo Vance. Leo, her oldest and dearest friend. A struggling artist she'd known since they were scholarship kids at the same prestigious university. He was her anchor to her old life, a reminder of who she was before the Blackwood name. He was funny, kind, and utterly platonic. They met for lunch once a month to catch up a tradition Damien had always known about, and she thought accepted. "Lunch?" Serafina said, her voice trembling with confusion. "Damien, this is from last month. I told you I was meeting Leo. Did you tell me he was holding your hand?" Damien's voice was a low growl. He pointed to the screen. The angle of the photo was deceptive. It looked like their hands were intertwined across the table, though in reality he had been passing her the salt shaker. "That's not Damien, you can't possibly believe. What am I supposed to believe?" He shot back, his voice rising. "I'm supposed to believe that my pregnant wife is having clandestine lunches with her starving artist ex-boyfriend." "He is not my ex-boyfriend," she cried, horrified. "He's my friend. You know that I know what I see, and I know what Isabella found." He opened another file. It was a string of text messages, supposedly between her phone and Leo's. They were flirtatious, intimate, and spoke of a shared secret. They were complete fabrications. "Those are fake," Serafina gasped, reaching for the laptop. "I never wrote those, Damien. This is insane. This is Isabella. Can't you see she's trying to poison you against me?" "Is she?" He sneered, his handsome face twisted into a mask of ugly suspicion. "Or is she the only one looking out for the Blackwood family? The only one brave enough to show me the truth?" Tears streamed down Serafina's face. "The truth is that I love you. The truth is that I am carrying your child." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the cavernous room. "My child. You expect me to believe that? Now, after all of this?" He advanced on her, his shadow swallowing her. He stopped just before her, his gaze dropping to her pregnant belly with a look of pure disgust. The words he spoke next were the ones that would shatter her universe. They were quiet, deliberate, and more violent than any physical blow. "I don't know whose child that is, Serafina," he said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "But until I do, you will not claim it as a Blackwood. As far as I'm concerned, this baby is not mine." The world tilted. The floor seemed to drop away from beneath her feet. The man she loved, the father of her child, had just disowned them both. The fairy tale was over. The nightmare had just begun. The days following Damien's accusation were a masterclass in psychological torment. The penthouse, once their sanctuary in the sky, transformed overnight into a gilded prison. The warm, smiling staff were replaced by a new crew, stoic and uncommunicative, their eyes sliding past Serafina as if she were a ghost. They were Isabella's people. Serafina was certain of it. Damien was a phantom. He moved into a separate wing of the penthouse, their paths crossing only by cold, calculated chance. When they did see each other, he looked right through her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The silence was the worst part. It was a living, breathing entity, thick with unspoken accusations and suffocating doubt. Serafina's attempts to reach him were met with a wall of ice. Her calls went to voicemail. Her texts remained unread. Her pleas to his personal assistant were politely but firmly rebuffed. "Mr. Blackwood is in meetings" became a constant, soul-crushing refrain. The isolation was absolute. Her keycard for the private elevator was deactivated, leaving her reliant on the service elevator, a humiliating journey shared with laundry carts and catering staff. Her credit cards tied to the Blackwood family account were declined. First at a local bookstore, then at a pharmacy when she tried to buy prenatal vitamins. The public shame was a hot flush on her cheeks. She was being systematically erased, stripped of her identity and autonomy, carrying the air Damien now refused to acknowledge. Her only lifeline was her younger sister, Chloe. Practical, fiery, and fiercely loyal Chloe was a paralegal who possessed a healthy skepticism of the ultra-rich that had only sharpened since Serafina's marriage. "I never trusted them, Sarah," Chloe said, her voice crackling with fury over the phone, one of the few lines they hadn't cut. "Not Damien, and especially not that black widow Isabella. She's playing him like a fiddle, and he's too arrogant to see it." Chloe tried to visit, but was stopped at the lobby by Blackwood security. "Mrs. Blackwood is not accepting visitors at this time," the guard said, his face impassive. Serafina watched from the window high above a prisoner in her own home as her sister argued vehemently before finally being forced to leave. Desperate, Serafina tried to contact Leo to warn him to understand how this had happened. But his number was disconnected. His social media pages were gone. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. She feared the worst, that Damien, with his immense power and resources, had done something to him. Meanwhile, Isabella and her son Julian grew bolder. They were frequent visitors to the penthouse, no longer for polite teas, but for strategy sessions with Damien in his study. Serafina would catch snippets of their conversations, words like legal recourse, protecting the estate, and paternity clause. Once she saw Julian clap a hand on Damien's shoulder, a look of faux sympathy on his face. "Whatever you need, brother," he'd said, his eyes flicking towards Serafina, down the hall with unconcealed triumph. "We're here to help you clean up this mess." The press, once their biggest cheerleaders, had turned into a pack of ravenous wolves. An anonymous source had leaked the story of a major rift in the Blackwood marriage, hinting at infidelity on Serafina's part. Paparazzi were camped outside their building day and night. Headlines screamed from the tabloids. "Blackwood baby scandal and billionaire's betrayal, is the heir an imposter?" Her image was being meticulously destroyed, and she was powerless to stop it. The breaking point came a month before her due date. Damien summoned her to his study. It was the first time they had been in the same room for a substantive conversation in weeks. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a king on his throne. Isabella and Julian stood behind him like vultures waiting for the kill. Serafina Damien began his voice, devoid of any emotion. "We need to discuss the situation." "You mean our child?" she said, her own voice steady, despite the frantic beating of her heart. She refused to let them see her break. "The child you are carrying," he corrected coldly. "Isabella has brought a solution to my attention, a way to resolve this unfortunate matter with discretion and finality." Isabella stepped forward, a smug, reptilian smile on her face. "It's quite simple, dear. A paternity test. Once the child is born, a sample will be taken. It will be processed at a lab of our choosing. If by some miracle the child is Damien's, he will do his duty. He will provide for it. If it is not, you will sign a non-disclosure agreement, relinquish any and all claims to the Blackwood name, and disappear." Quietly. The audacity of it took Serafina's breath away. A lab of their choosing. The results would be whatever they paid for them to be. It was a checkmate. "You would rig it," Serafina said, looking directly at Damien, pleading with her eyes for him to see reason. "You would let her steal our child's birthright. It's about protecting the family legacy from an outside threat," Damien stated, parroting a line that was surely fed to him by his stepmother. A fire ignited in Serafina's soul. The fear and despair that had crippled her for weeks burned away, replaced by a white-hot, cleansing rage. They thought she was a fragile doll they could break and discard. They were wrong. She came from a line of strong women who had faced hardship without flinching. She would not be a victim in her own life story. She stood up straighter, her hand resting protectively on her belly. She had one card left to play. It was a wild, desperate gamble, but it was all she had. "All right," she said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. The three of them looked at her, surprised by her sudden compliance. "I agree to the DNA test." Serafina continued, her gaze unwavering. "But not on your terms. On mine." Damien raised a skeptical eyebrow. "And what are your terms? It won't be done in secret in some lab you control. It will be done in public, in front of everyone." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "The annual Starlight Charity Gala is in 2 weeks. It's the biggest event of the year. The entire city will be there. The press, your business partners, your so-called friends. We'll do it there. On stage." Isabella gasped. Julian looked momentarily flustered. Even Damien seemed taken aback. "That's preposterous," Isabella hissed. "Washing our dirty laundry in public. It's the only way I can be sure the laundry isn't tampered with." Serafina retorted, her eyes locked on Damien. a renowned independent medical professional, a certified lab with a direct, secure video feed. The results will be revealed live for the entire world to see. She took a step closer to the desk, leaning forward slightly. You are so certain of my betrayal, Damien. You're so convinced that this baby isn't yours. If that's true, then this is your ultimate vindication. You can expose me as a fraud in front of everyone and be seen as the wronged party. But if you're wrong, if you have dragged my name and the name of your own child through the mud for nothing, then the whole world will watch you fall. She added the final masterstroke. And what better stage than the Gala your foundation hosts? This year, it's sponsored by Bulgari, isn't it? A brand synonymous with eternal promises. How fitting. A tense silence filled the study. Damien stared at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Was it shock? Reluctant admiration? He was trapped. To refuse her proposal now would be an admission of doubt, a sign of weakness. His pride, the very core of his being, would not allow it. Isabella was whispering furiously in his ear, but he waved her away. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow. He looked at Serafina, the woman he once loved, now his adversary in a war of his own making. Fine, he said the word, clipped and sharp. You want a public spectacle? You'll get one. The Gala, on stage, let the world watch. Serafina nodded once, a silent declaration of war. She turned and walked out of the study, her head held high. The gamble had been accepted. The stage was set. At the Starlight Gala in front of the city's elite, the truth would finally have its audience. The night of the Starlight Charity Gala arrived with an electric tension that seemed to crackle in the city air. The venue was the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, a space transformed into a celestial wonderland. Thousands of twinkling fairy lights were draped from the ceiling, mimicking a starry night sky. The tables were adorned with cascades of white orchids and shimmering crystal. At the entrance, a massive, elegantly designed banner read, "The Blackwood Foundation Starlight Gala, in partnership with Bulgari." The Italian luxury brand's sponsorship was evident everywhere, from the exquisite serpenti necklace displayed in a glass case for auction to the subtle logos on the programs. This was the apex of the city's social calendar, a confluence of old money, new tech billionaires, politicians and celebrities. But tonight, the usual air of festive schmoozing was replaced by something more predatory. The guests weren't just here to donate and be seen. They were here for the drama. The whispers followed Damien Blackwood as he entered. He was a portrait of cold, controlled power in a classic black tuxedo. He moved through the crowd with his usual confidence, but a keen observer would notice the tightness around his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the room with a hunter's intensity. Isabella and Julian flanked him. Isabella, looking positively radiant in a venom-green gown, her smile as sharp as glass. She absorbed the curious stares and hushed gossip like a plant absorbing sunlight. This was her moment of triumph, the culmination of her meticulous planning. Then Serafina arrived. A collective, hushed intake of breath swept through the ballroom. She had chosen her armor with care. She wore a gown of the deepest midnight blue silk that draped over her 8-month pregnant form, not to hide it, but to celebrate it. The fabric shimmered under the chandeliers, making her look like the night sky itself. Around her neck was the only piece of jewelry. She wore a simple, delicate diamond pendant. A gift from Damien, from their first anniversary. A relic from a time when he'd looked at her with love, not suspicion. Her hair was swept up, Her face was elegantly made up, and her eyes held a calm, resolute fire. She was not a victim seeking pity. She was a queen, arriving to reclaim her throne. Her sister Chloe was by her side, a protective sentinel in a sleek black dress, her eyes daring anyone to cast a judgmental glance. As Serafina walked through the room, the whispers grew louder. There she is. She has some nerve showing her face. She looks magnificent, but still, can you imagine the scandal I heard the father is her artist friend? Damien threw him out of the country. Isabella Blackwood looks like the cat who got the cream. She's won. Serafina ignored them all. Her focus was singular, aimed directly at the man standing near the stage. As her eyes met Damien's across the crowded room, the entire world seemed to fall away. For a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of the man she had married, a flash of pain, of conflict, of regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the now familiar mask of cold indifference. He gave her a stiff, barely perceptible nod, the kind one gives to a business acquaintance, not the mother of their child. The cut was so deep, so final, it solidified her resolve. There was no going back. The early part of the evening was a surreal performance of civility. Speeches were made, donations were pledged, a fabulous dinner was served, but no one could truly focus on the food or the pleasantries. The main event was yet to come. The tension was a palpable, tightening coil. Finally, the moment arrived. Damien took to the stage, the spotlight following him. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth and commanding, amplified throughout the silent ballroom. Thank you for your generosity tonight. The Blackwood Foundation has always been about legacy, about building a better future. But legacy is also built on truth. And tonight we are going to face a very personal truth publicly. He sounded like a man in control. A man wronged but willing to seek clarity with dignity. Serafina had to admit it was a masterful performance. As many of you have heard through whispers and speculation, there have been questions surrounding my family and the child my wife Serafina is carrying. His use of my wife was a deliberate, sharp twist of the knife. We have mutually agreed to answer these questions once and for all. Tonight, right here. He gestured to the side of the stage. A woman in a crisp white lab coat, Dr. Aris Thorne, a renowned geneticist with an impeccable reputation, walked out, followed by 2 assistants wheeling a small high-tech medical cart. Dr. Thorne will be taking samples from myself and from Serafina Damien, announced. These samples will be processed by a certified independent laboratory, with the results transmitted directly and securely to the screen behind me. There will be no interference, no speculation, just science, just the truth. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the audience. They had expected drama, but not this. This was a gladiatorial contest. It was brutal, unprecedented, and utterly captivating. Serafina ascended the stage steps, her heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm. She took her place beside Damien, the space between them a chasm of betrayal. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. She met their gazes without flinching. Dr. Thorne addressed the audience. The process is simple and transparent. We will be conducting a buccal swab from both Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Blackwood. The DNA will be sequenced to create a profile. We will then compare Mr. Blackwood's profile to the fetal DNA present in Mrs. Blackwood's maternal blood sample, which was drawn earlier under supervised conditions. The test determines the probability of paternity. The results are definitive. The procedure was carried out with clinical efficiency. Thorne first swabbed the inside of Damien's cheek. Then she approached Serafina. As the soft swab touched her mouth, Serafina looked out at the sea of faces. She saw Isabella in the front row, her face alight with vicious anticipation. She saw Julian, a smirk playing on his lips, and she saw Damien standing like a statue, his face a grim, unreadable slate. The samples are now being processed. The Thorn announced, her voice echoing in the pin-drop silence. The secure upload will take approximately 15 minutes. We ask for your patience. 15 minutes. The final 15 minutes of her old life. Serafina stood on that stage under the glare of the hot lights, feeling utterly alone, yet strangely powerful. She had placed her entire future and the future of her child on a single desperate gamble. The grand, opulent ballroom felt like a courtroom, and the entire world was the jury. The clock began to tick. The 15 minutes that followed felt like a rip in the fabric of time, a pocket of suspended animation where the entire world held its breath. On the brightly lit stage, the three central figures of the drama stood frozen in a silent tableau, the giant screen behind them displaying its serene loading bar was a merciless clock counting down to absolution or annihilation. Every second stretched into an eternity, thick with unspoken thoughts and simmering emotions. For Serafina, it was a trial by fire. She stood a solitary island of defiant grace, her hands clasped over the gentle swell of her belly. She forced her breathing to remain even a meditative rhythm against the frantic pounding of her heart. This was the precipice. Below her lay two possible futures, one of public redemption and the reclamation of her honor, the other a bottomless abyss of shame and exile. Her mind, a whirlwind of fear and resolve, flashed with memories. She saw Damien, his face illuminated by moonlight on their honeymoon, whispering promises of forever. Then the image soured, shifting to his face contorted by cold fury in their penthouse, his voice a venomous whisper as he disowned their child. She steeled herself against the memory. He had made his choice. Now science would make hers. She sent a silent prayer, not to a god, but to the truth itself, hoping it was strong enough to burn through the web of lies that had ensnared her. Damien, by contrast, was a monolith of self-assured fury. He stood with his arms crossed, his posture radiating an impatient, righteous anger. In his mind, this spectacle was a necessary, if distasteful, final act. He was already composing the speech he would give when the inevitable result confirmed his suspicions. He would be magnanimous in his victory, of course. He would speak of the sanctity of the Blackwood name, the pain of betrayal, and the unfortunate necessity of this public airing. He would cast Serafina out, not with overt cruelty, but with the cold, surgical pity of a man deeply wronged. He glanced at her, standing there in her midnight blue gown, and felt a pang of something he refused to name. Was it regret? No, it was disappointment. Disappointment that the beautiful vessel he had chosen for his legacy had proven to be so flawed. He hardened his heart against it. The truth would soon set him free. And in the front row, Isabella Blackwood was basking in the glow of imminent triumph. She radiated a predatory stillness, her eyes fixed on the stage, her smile a thin, cruel slash of red lipstick. She could already taste the victory. The lab she had suggested to Damien was one where her influence ran deep. While she hadn't needed to rig this test, convinced as she was of Serafina's guilt, she had ensured that if any anomalies occurred, the result would default to their desired outcome. She imagined the aftermath, Serafina disgraced and banished. Damien heartbroken and vulnerable, leaning on his loving stepmother for support. And then the slow, patient process of elevating her own son, Julian, to a position of power within the empire, securing her own future indefinitely. It was all unfolding exactly as she had designed. Finally, a soft electronic chime echoed through the ballroom, sharp and sudden as a cracking whip. The loading bar on the screen vanished, replaced by the official letterhead of the genetics laboratory. Dr. Aris Thorne. Her face impassive, stepped toward the microphone. "The results are complete," she announced, her voice cutting through the thick silence. "The laboratory has successfully sequenced the DNA profiles and performed the paternity comparison analysis. The document on the screen scrolled down, revealing complex charts of genetic markers. And then it stopped. At the very bottom, in letters large enough for even those in the back rows to see, the conclusion appeared. Subject Damien Blackwood. Alleged father comparison to fetal DNA. Probability of paternity. 99.999%. A single word blazed beneath the percentage stark and unequivocal match. The sound that swept through the room was not a simple gasp. It was a physical shockwave of sound, a collective vocal shudder of disbelief. The narrative that had been so carefully crafted, so widely accepted, had just been detonated. For Serafina, the wave of relief was so powerful it was nearly incapacitating. The tension that had held her spine rigid for months dissolved in an instant, and she felt a dizzying lightness as if she might float away. The tears that sprang to her eyes were hot and cleansing, washing away the stain of the accusations, the humiliation of the isolation. She brought a trembling hand to her mouth, a sob of pure, unadulterated vindication escaping her lips. It was true. She had never betrayed him. Her son was his son. Damien stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. 19. Match. The words were meaningless, an error, a glitch in the system. It was impossible. He had seen the photos. He had read the texts. He had been so certain his conviction, a bedrock upon which he had built his righteous anger. But the bedrock was now sand crumbling beneath his feet. He looked from the glaring screen to Serafina's tear-streaked face, not tears of guilt, but of triumph, and the first crack appeared in his fortress of arrogance. A horrifying, sickening thought wormed its way into his mind. What if I was wrong? But the most potent reaction was Isabella's. Her perfectly painted smile didn't just falter. It shattered. Her face, moments before, alight with predatory glee, contorted into a brief, uncontrolled mask of incandescent rage. Her eyes, wide with shock, flashed with a venomous disbelief. Impossible. How could this be her entire plan? Her meticulously built house of cards had just been blown apart by a single, irrefutable fact. She saw her future of influence and power vanishing in the glare of that screen. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy. Reporters were shouting their camera flashes, strobing like lightning in a hurricane. This was the story of the decade. The billionaire had been wrong. The wronged wife was vindicated. Serafina took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to step forward and speak, to finally reclaim her voice. But a new voice, calm and laced with an undeniable authority, sliced through the pandemonium. "Please, a moment." The crowd quieted, turning to see Marcus Vance, the silver-haired, semi-retired patriarch of the Blackwood legal dynasty, striding purposefully toward the stage. His presence commanded immediate respect. He had been Sterling Blackwood's most trusted advisor, a man of unimpeachable integrity. Damien stared at him bewildered. Marcus, what is the meaning of this intrusion? Marcus ignored him, his gaze fixed upon Dr. Thorne. He held up a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with the dark blue wax of his old law firm. Dr. Thorne, my apologies for the interruption. However, I am legally bound to act. This envelope contains a sworn directive from my late client, Sterling Blackwood. His instructions were explicit. It was to be opened only in the event that Damien Blackwood publicly and formally questioned the paternity of his own heir. That condition, as we have all just witnessed, has been met. A new, more profound wave of confusion silenced the room. A directive from the grave. What are you talking about? Damien demanded, his voice strained. Isabella was on her feet, her face a mask of panic. Marcus, stop this at once. This is a private family matter. You have no right. The shrillness of her tone was a confession in itself. On the contrary, Isabella. Marcus countered, his voice like ice. Sterling feared this day might come. He worried that Damien's pride, a trait he felt was inherited from his mother, could lead him to make a catastrophic error in judgment. Sterling's directive is clear. Should that happen, the full truth of the Blackwood legacy must be made public. Dr. Thorne, you are instructed to run a second comparison. A comparison between whom, the geneticist asked her. Professional curiosity piqued. Marcus Vance's reply dropped like a stone into the silent room. You have Damien Blackwood's genetic profile. The archives of this firm hold a secure, court-verified sample of Sterling Blackwood's DNA. The directive instructs you to compare father and son. The foundation of the entire evening shifted. This was no longer about a marital dispute. It was about the very identity of the man who led the Blackwood Empire. This is insane, Damien roared, a desperate edge to his voice. I am my father's son. This is a pathetic theatrical game, but Dr. Thorne, bound by the legal document, was already at her console, her fingers flying across the screen. A new comparison chart loaded. This time there was no 15-minute wait. The profiles were already in the system. The progress bar filled in seconds. Damien watched, his face ashen, the horrifying realization of a deeper trap finally dawning on him. This wasn't Serafina's doing. This was a ghost from his father's past, reaching out to expose a secret he never knew existed. The screen refreshed. The result flashed stark and brutal. Paternity comparison. Damien Blackwood and Sterling. Blackwood deceased. Probability of paternity %. The word beneath it was a death sentence to his identity. No match. If the first result had caused a shockwave, this one was an apocalypse. The ballroom didn't just erupt, it detonated. The sound was a visceral roar of astonishment and scandal. Damien Blackwood was not a Blackwood. The heir was an imposter. Damien physically recoiled, as if he'd been struck by lightning. The world dissolved into a meaningless swirl of light and sound. His name, his father, his legacy, all of it vaporized. He looked at Isabella, whose face was now a landscape of pure terror, and he finally understood her frantic need to control the succession. She had always known. But Marcus Vance, the executor of Sterling's final will, was not finished. The final devastating act was yet to come. Sterling Blackwood knew he was not Damien's biological father. Marcus announced, his voice resonating with grim authority over the chaos. He chose to raise the boy as his own, out of a sense of duty. But he was a man who believed above all else in bloodline. He spent years searching for the family he thought he'd lost. Marcus paused, letting his words hang in the air. He had a son, a biological son from a brief relationship long before he met Damien's mother. A child he located and supported from afar, honoring the mother's wish for a life of anonymity. Marcus turned his gaze from the stage to the wings, to a shadowed corner where a figure stood paralyzed with confusion. The spotlight operator, sensing the climax, swung the beam of light, illuminating the stunned face of Leo Vance. Sterling Blackwood's true heir. Marcus declared, his voice booming like a judge's gavel. The sole biological inheritor of the Blackwood name and fortune is the very man Damien Blackwood has spent the last few months trying to discredit and destroy. The revelation was a masterpiece of cosmic irony. Leo, the penniless artist, the accused adulterer, the man Damien saw as a worthless insect, was the true king. He stared out from the wings, his face a canvas of utter bewilderment, as hundreds of phones and cameras turned to him. On stage, the last vestiges of Damien's composure disintegrated. The sound that tore from his throat was primal, a howl of a man who had not just lost everything, but had discovered he never had it in the first place. He was a phantom who had been haunting his own life. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the stage, a great titan reduced to a heap of broken pride. In the front row, the final shock was too much for Isabella. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she fainted, slumping gracelessly in her chair. The Gala had become a ruin, and standing in the center of the wreckage, her hand still resting on her child, the one true Blackwood heir present on that stage, was Serafina. She had come seeking justice and had inadvertently inherited a kingdom, a silent, vindicated queen, reigning over the ashes of an empire of lies. The Starlight Gala did not end. It fractured. The moment the words "no match" burned onto the giant screen, the carefully constructed facade of high society shattered into a million pieces. The air, once thick with suspense, was now choked with the cacophony of pure pandemonium. It was a roar of collective disbelief, a tidal wave of scandal that washed over the grand ballroom, drowning civility in its wake. Guests who had been sitting in stunned silence were now on their feet, their faces a mixture of horror, morbid glee, and frantic excitement. Phones were held aloft, not just taking pictures, but live streaming the complete and utter demolition of a dynasty. On stage, Damien Blackwood was at the epicenter of his own personal earthquake. The revelation that his son was, in fact, his own had been a shock that rattled his foundations. But this second truth, that his entire life was a lie, was a cataclysm that leveled him completely. He didn't just hear Marcus Vance's words. He felt them as a physical blow stealing the air from his lungs and the strength from his bones. He stumbled backward, his hand clutching at his chest, not from a heart attack, but as if trying to hold his very identity inside his body. His gaze, wit and disbelieving, darted from the damning words on the screen to the ashen, panicked face of Isabella. In her terror, he saw the confirmation. He saw decades of deceit. The name that had been his shield, his sword, and his crown was nothing more than a costume he'd been forced to wear. The guttural, wounded sound that escaped his lips was the cry of a king being stripped of his robes, his title, and his very soul before a jeering crowd. As he crumpled to his knees, the relentless barrage of camera flashes was like a volley of gunfire, each spark a bullet piercing his shattered pride. The social death of Isabella and Julian was swift and brutal. Isabella's faint was no theatrical swoon. She had crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Julian, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, tried to rush to her side, shouting, "This is a lie! A conspiracy!" But no one was listening. The very people who had fawned over them minutes before now stared with cold contempt. They were no longer connected to the seat of power. They were obstacles, embarrassing footnotes to the main event. As security guards, grim-faced and efficient, moved to clear the stage, they were swept aside with the rest of the debris, their desperate protests lost in the din. While chaos reigned in the ballroom, an eerie calm settled over the backstage green room. It became a sanctuary, a pocket of stillness in the heart of the storm. Serafina, guided by Chloe, sank into a plush velvet armchair, the adrenaline that had been her armor for weeks finally dissolving, leaving her trembling with exhaustion and overwhelming relief. Chloe wrapped a thick blanket around her, a simple grounding gesture of sisterly protection. Marcus Vance entered his face, somber but resolute, followed by a pale and shell-shocked Leo. The artist looked as though he had been plucked from his life and dropped into a surreal, incomprehensible dream. He stared at Serafina, his oldest friend, the woman he had just seen publicly vindicated in the most dramatic way imaginable. "Sarah." Leo's voice was a ragged whisper. He ran a hand through his already messy hair. "Sterling Blackwood. My father. It doesn't make any sense. My mother. She adored my father. She told me he was a kind man, a poet who died in an accident. She never spoke of wealth or power." Marcus Vance offered a sad, knowing smile. "Your mother Eleanor was the one true love of Sterling's life. He met her long before his other marriages, but she was fiercely independent. She refused to be part of his world, a world she saw as corrupt and suffocating. When she found out she was pregnant, she left wanting to raise you far from the Blackwood name. Sterling respected her wishes, but he never stopped loving her, and he never stopped watching over you from a distance. The trust fund was his way of ensuring his son, the son of the woman he truly loved, could live his life on his own terms." The weight of this history settled in the room. It was a story of lost love, of secrets, held for decades, all of it crashing into the present moment. For Serafina, it was a dizzying realization. The man Damien had painted as a worthless parasite was in fact the product of a love purer than any the Blackwood dynasty had known since. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and media saturation. The Blackwood revelation dominated every news cycle. Damien spirited away to a secluded estate in the Catskills owned by his biological mother's family, became a ghost. The few paparazzi shots that emerged were of a gaunt, bearded man, a hollowed-out shell of the titan he once was. He was a prisoner in a fortress of his own, making haunted by a truth he could not escape. His punishment was not poverty, but irrelevance. He had to live every day knowing that the son he had refused to claim was the only true Blackwood between them. Serafina acted with a clarity that surprised everyone but her sister. The morning after the gala, she met with a team of divorce lawyers. She didn't want revenge. She wanted a severance. She walked into the conference room, her pregnant form a symbol of the future, and laid out her terms, a clean break, a generous but finite settlement to secure her and her son's future, and a gag order preventing Damien from ever contesting the narrative again. Damien's lawyers, under immense pressure from a panicked Blackwood Enterprises board, desperate to contain the PR disaster, agreed without a fight. They knew a court battle would be a prolonged public crucifixion. Leaving the penthouse was the final act of her liberation. She moved through the vast, silent rooms, once a symbol of her fairy tale life, now a mausoleum of lies. She packed only what was truly hers: her books, her clothes, a few cherished pieces of art. The last thing she took was the Bivalgari Serpenti necklace she had seen at the Gala, which Leo had quietly purchased from the auction and had sent to her. It was no longer a symbol of high society, but a reminder of a serpent shedding its skin to be reborn. Standing at the panoramic window one last time, looking down at the city that had been her kingdom and her prison, she felt no sadness, only the quiet thrill of release. Leo, meanwhile, was adrift in an ocean of responsibility. He was now on paper one of the wealthiest men in the world. He spent long, difficult days with Marcus Vance, trying to comprehend the labyrinthine structure of the empire he had inherited. His first instinct was to run to sell it all and retreat to his studio. But in conversations with Serafina, he found a new purpose. She reminded him of the power he now wielded, the power to effect real change. He established a new independent board to run the corporate machine, and then he began the work that truly mattered to him. He liquidated many of the company's more ruthless assets and poured hundreds of millions into relaunching the Blackwood Foundation, transforming it into the world's largest private endowment for the arts and humanities. 3 weeks later, in a quiet hospital room overlooking the ocean, Serafina gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby boy. She held him in her arms, studying his perfect, tiny face. He had her eyes, but a determined set to his mouth that was, she had to admit, all Damien. But he would not carry that burden. She would not name him Damien Jr., a constant reminder of his father's failure, nor sterling tying him to a legacy of secrets. She named him Alexander Valerius. He would carry her name, a name of strength and resilience. He would be his own man, his own legacy. Her new life took root in a rambling, sun-bleached house on the California coast. It was a place of light and air, with large windows that opened to the sea and gardens filled with wildflowers. Here the only whispers were the rustling of leaves and the gentle murmur of the waves. It was here months later that the final healing began. She sat on a wide, shaded porch, rocking Alexander in her arms. Leo was with her, sitting on the steps, a sketchbook open on his lap. He wasn't drawing the spectacular sunset. He was capturing the way Alexander's tiny fingers curled around Serafina's thumb. There was an easy peace between them, a deep friendship reforged in the crucible of the Gala. They were two people whose lives had been irrevocably changed, bound together by a bizarre twist of fate, now building a new definition of family. Serafina looked from her sleeping son to the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The storm had passed. She had navigated the treacherous waters of deceit and betrayal, and had reached a shore she never knew she was searching for. She had lost a gilded cage and gained the entire world. Here, with her son in her arms and a true friend by her side, she was not a Blackwood or a Valerius, not a victim or a victor. She was simply finally free. And so a story that began with a billionaire's cruel rejection ended with the quiet triumph of a woman who refused to be broken. Serafina's journey shows us that truth is the most powerful currency of all, and that integrity is a greater inheritance than any fortune. Damien Blackwood lost everything because he valued his pride more than his family. Leo Vance gained a world he never asked for, and chose to reshape it with kindness. What do you think? Was Damien a villain or a man manipulated into betraying his own heart? Could you ever forgive him? What would you do if you were in Leo's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This story is a powerful reminder that the most shocking dramas aren't just fiction. They echo the real-life struggles of love, lies, and the quest for justice. A gasp rippled through the gilded ballroom of the St. Regis Hanoi. All eyes were on the woman in crimson. Her hand still raised, her face a mask of triumph. Before her, the gentle, pregnant wife of billionaire mogul Marcus Thorne stumbled. A hand protectively clutching her swollen belly, the imprint of a slap blooming on her cheek. The city's elite watched breathless as the mistress, bold and unrepentant, declared her victory. But the real drama wasn't the public humiliation or the shattered illusion of a perfect marriage. The true bombshell was nestled deep inside the womb, a secret waiting to be revealed not by words, but by the frantic telling rhythm of a tiny unborn heart. Isabella Thorne believed her life was a fairy tale. At 26, she was the wife of Marcus Thorne, a man whose name was synonymous with power in Southeast Asia's tech scene. Their love story was the stuff of legend, a whirlwind romance that saw a humble art curator marry into one of Hanoi's most influential families. Marcus was her everything, charming, attentive, and fiercely protective. He had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams, a sprawling penthouse overlooking West Lake, a wardrobe filled with bespoke creations from designers like Kong Tri, and a love that felt as solid as the ancient stones of the nearby Temple of Literature. Now, 6 months pregnant with their first child, a son, Isabella felt her world was complete. The nursery was a symphony of soft blues and creams, filled with handcrafted toys and imported furniture. Marcus had been ecstatic, hosting lavish dinners to announce the heir to the Thorne empire. He would often rest his hand on her belly, his eyes alight with a joy that seemed to mirror her own. "Our legacy, my love." He'd whisper, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I do for you and for him." But lately, hairline cracks had begun to appear in the flawless facade of their life. Marcus was working later, his phone calls becoming more frequent and hushed. He'd attribute it to a new acquisition, a hostile takeover that required his undivided attention. Isabella, trusting and devoted, accepted his explanations. She'd wait for him, the chef-prepared meals growing cold on the polished mahogany table, her own reflection in the panoramic windows, her only company. The whispers started subtly, a shadow of a rumor caught in the clinking of champagne glasses at charity galas. A name, Camila, was mentioned in hushed tones by women adorned in diamonds and envy. Isabella ignored them. The high society of Hanoi was a viper's nest of jealousy, and she, the ingenue who had captured its most eligible bachelor, was the prime target. Camila, as Isabella would soon learn, was Camila Tran, a ruthlessly ambitious socialite and a former flame of Marcus's from his university days. While Isabella exuded a quiet, cultured grace, Camila was a firestorm. Her laughter was loud, her dresses were daring, and her ambition was an open secret. She had recently returned to Hanoi after a stint in Singapore, and her re-entry into their circle was as subtle as a lightning strike. The first time Isabella felt a genuine pang of unease was at the annual Vietnam Innovators Gala, held at the opulent St. Regis Hanoi. Marcus, who was receiving the top award, was uncharacteristically distracted all evening. His eyes kept flitting towards the entrance, his grip on her hand just a fraction too tight. And then Camilla had arrived. She wore a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin, a stark, audacious slash of color in a sea of elegant pastels and classic blacks. She moved through the crowd with the predatory grace of a panther, her gaze locking onto Marcus across the ballroom. Isabella saw the flicker of something in her husband's eyes, not just recognition, but something deeper, more complicated. A ghost of a memory, a shared history that excluded her. Throughout the night, she watched as Camilla artfully cornered Marcus, her hand lingering on his arm, her laughter echoing a little too loudly in their conversations. Marcus, for his part, seemed flustered, a state so alien to his usual composed demeanor that it set Isabella's nerves on edge. "She's just an old friend, darling," he had reassured her later that night, his voice smooth as silk. A bit intense, but harmless. He had pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers, and for a moment the warmth of his embrace melted her fears. She wanted to believe him. To doubt Marcus was to doubt the very foundation of her world. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. A week later, a receipt for a lavish bouquet of black roses, a flower Isabella detested but knew was Camilla's favorite, fell out of his briefcase. He'd brushed it off as a corporate gift. Then there was the late-night text that buzzed on his phone, a simple "thinking of you" from a number he quickly deleted. The excuses became more elaborate, the distance between them growing from a hairline crack to a chasm. Isabella felt a profound and suffocating loneliness. The sprawling penthouse, once a symbol of her fairy tale life, now felt like a gilded cage. Her friends, mostly wives of Marcus's business associates, offered sympathetic but ultimately hollow words. They were part of this world, they understood its unspoken rules, the silent accommodations, the turning of a blind eye. But Isabella's heart, pure and perhaps a little naive, couldn't accept that. Love to her was not a transaction or an arrangement. It was a sacred, all-consuming truth. The pregnancy, once her greatest joy, now became a source of anxiety. She felt a desperate need to protect her unborn son, not just from the world, but from the encroaching shadows in her own home. She tried to talk to Marcus to break through the wall he was meticulously building around himself. "Is everything all right, Marcus?" she asked one evening, her hand on his arm, as he stared out at the city lights. "You seem so far away." He turned his face a carefully constructed mask of affection. "Just stress, my love. This deal is draining. Once it's over, it'll be just the three of us. I promise." He tilted her chin up and kissed her, a perfunctory gesture that no longer reached his eyes. Isabella knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that he was lying. The deal wasn't about business. The hostile takeover was happening right under her roof, and the enemy was not a rival corporation, but a woman in a crimson dress who smelled of black roses and broken promises. The fairy tale was over. Isabella was trapped, pregnant, and alone, standing on the precipice of a devastating truth, with no idea just how brutal the revelation would be. The breaking point arrived with an embossed cream-colored invitation. The Thorn Corporation was celebrating its 50th anniversary with a grand ball. It was to be the social event of the season, a testament to the family's enduring legacy and power. For Isabella, it felt less like a celebration and more like a stage for the final act of her disintegrating marriage. In the weeks leading up to the event, Marcus was a whirlwind of activity, but his focus was sharp, his mood almost buoyant. He presented Isabella with a stunning midnight blue gown by a Parisian couturier and a sapphire necklace that mirrored the depths of West Lake. "You will be the most beautiful woman there," he said, his voice brimming with a sincerity she hadn't heard in months. The mother of my son, the queen of my heart. For a fleeting, hopeful moment, Isabella allowed herself to believe him. Perhaps the affair, the whispers, the lies had been a fleeting madness. Perhaps this night was his way of reaffirming their bond, of showing the world, and her, that she was the one who truly mattered. She pushed her anxieties down, focusing on the baby's gentle kicks, a secret language of reassurance between mother and child. The night of the ballroom of the St. Regis Hanoi, was transformed into an enchanted forest from a Vietnamese folk tale. Thousands of orchids cascaded from the ceilings, and the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the low hum of high-powered conversations. Isabella, on Marcus's arm, was a vision of serene elegance. The deep blue of her gown complemented her pregnancy, and the thorn sapphires at her throat glittered with every turn of her head. She smiled. She mingled. She played the part of the perfect billionaire's wife, all while a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She knew Camilla would be there. It was inevitable. And sure enough, she saw her holding court by the champagne fountain, not in her usual audacious red, but in a startlingly white, almost bridal gown. The dress was a deliberate, provocative choice, an open challenge. Camilla's eyes found Isabella's across the room, and she offered a slow, deliberate smile that was anything but friendly. Marcus stiffened beside her. "Ignore her," he murmured, his grip on her elbow becoming possessive. "Tonight is about us." But Camilla had no intention of being ignored. As the night wore on, she seemed to be everywhere Isabella was. If Isabella moved to the terrace for a breath of fresh air, Camilla would appear moments later, her laughter sharp and piercing. If Isabella paused to speak with an acquaintance, Camilla would glide past her perfume, the cloying scent of black roses leaving a toxic trail. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare, and it was working. Isabella's composure began to fray. The climax came just after the main speeches. Marcus had just delivered a moving tribute to his family and the future of his company, concluding with a toast to my beautiful wife Isabella and our son, who will one day lead this legacy. The room erupted in applause. Beaming Marcus turned to kiss her, a public display of affection designed to cement their image as the perfect couple. It was in that moment of manufactured bliss that Camilla made her move. She strode towards their central table, her white dress parting the sea of guests like the prow of a ship. There was no hesitation in her steps, no doubt in her eyes. The murmuring of the crowd died down as she approached, a collective intake of breath, creating a vacuum of silence in the grand ballroom. She stopped directly in front of Isabella, who was still seated. Marcus, caught off guard, stood halfway, his smile frozen on his face. "Legacy." Camilla's voice was clear and cold, slicing through the silence. "Your son." She laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Marcus, you are a wonderful storyteller, but you seem to have forgotten the main character." She turned her venomous gaze on Isabella. "You poor, pathetic little thing. Did you really believe all of it? The love story. The happy family." Isabella, stunned into silence, could only stare up at her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What am I talking about?" Camilla's voice rose, theatrical and cruel. "I'm talking about the fact that the child you are carrying is not the only Thorn heir. I'm talking about the fact that Marcus has been with me in my bed every night, He told you he was working late." Gasps rippled through the room. People were now openly staring, their phones discreetly raised to capture the unfolding drama. Marcus finally found his voice. "Camilla, that's enough. You're making a scene." "I'm making a scene," she shrieked, her composure finally cracking to reveal the raw fury beneath. "You're the one who has been living a lie. You promised me, Marcus. You promised you would leave her." She then looked back at Isabella, her eyes filled with a terrifying mix of pity and contempt. "He was never going to leave me." This, she gestured at Isabella's belly, was just a little complication, an air for the public. But his heart, his passion, that belongs to me. Isabella felt the world tilt on its axis. The faces of the guests blurred into a grotesque gallery of gawking masks. She looked at Marcus silently, pleading with him to deny it, to say something to defend her. But he stood there, his face pale, his eyes darting between the two women, a trapped animal. His silence was the only confession she needed. Tears welled in Isabella's eyes, hot and shameful. She felt a protective instinct surge through her, a primal need to shield her son from this ugliness. She tried to stand to escape the suffocating scrutiny. "Please, stop," she managed to say. But Camilla was not finished. She saw the tears, the vulnerability, and she went in for the kill. "You think you've won? You think this baby solidifies your position? You are nothing but an incubator, a vessel." And then, with a movement so swift it seemed to surprise even herself, Camilla leaned forward and swung her arm. Crack! The sound was sharp and shockingly loud in the silent room. Isabella's head snapped to the side, the force of the blow sending a jolt through her entire body. A collective, horrified gasp erupted from the onlookers. For a moment, there was only the stinging heat on her cheek and the stunned realization of what had just happened. Camilla, the mistress, had slapped the pregnant wife of Marcus Thorne in front of everyone. Isabella stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, but her other arm wrapped instinctively, desperately around her stomach. The humiliation was a physical blow, a crushing weight that stole the air from her lungs. She looked at the faces around her. The shock, the pity, the morbid curiosity. She looked at Marcus, whose face was a canvas of horror and indecision. And then she looked at Camilla, who stood there, her chest heaving, her hand still tingling, a triumphant, hateful glare in her eyes. The fairy tale had not just ended. It had been violently, publicly, and irrevocably shattered, and as a sharp, cramping pain shot through her abdomen, Isabella realized the slap was not the most painful blow she would receive that night. The real agony was just beginning. The slap echoed in the cavernous ballroom, a definitive, brutal end to the night's festivities. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic tableau of shock and confusion. For a heartbeat, everyone, including Marcus, seemed frozen. Then the world lurched back into motion. Isabella, her mind reeling from the dual assault of humiliation and physical pain, felt her knees buckle. The sharp cramp in her lower abdomen intensified, radiating outwards in a wave of pure agony. A small, involuntary pruos escaped her lips. "My baby," she whispered, her voice choked with terror. Her protective instinct overrode everything else. The shame, the anger, the betrayal. All that mattered was the tiny, precious life inside her. It was not her husband who caught her. It was his father, Arthur Thorne, the family patriarch, who had been watching from a nearby table with an expression of grim fury. He surged forward, his old but still powerful frame moving with surprising speed, catching Isabella's arm, just as she was about to collapse. "Get her a chair! Someone call a doctor!" he bellowed, his voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms, cutting through the stunned murmurs of the crowd. Marcus finally snapped out of his paralysis. "Isabella." He rushed to her side, his face a mess of panic and guilt. "My God, are you all right?" He reached for her, but she flinched away, her eyes filled with more pain than he had ever seen meeting his. In that single searing glance, he saw the complete and utter destruction of her trust in him. Camilla, meanwhile, seemed to realize the enormity of her actions. The triumphant fire in her eyes flickered, replaced by a flicker of panic. Assaulting anyone in this public manner was scandalous. Striking a pregnant woman was a cardinal sin, even in the morally flexible world of the super-rich. She took a half-step back, her gaze darting towards the exits. She had intended to cause a scene to force Marcus's hand, but this was spiraling out of control. I didn't mean," she began, but her words were cut off by Arthur Thorne's glacial stare. "You," he said, his voice low and lethally soft, "will not move an inch." Security. Two imposing men in dark suits materialized at his side. "Escort Miss Tran to a private room, and do not let her leave." Camilla's face paled. She opened her mouth to protest, but one look at the unyielding fury in Arthur's eyes silenced her. Without another word, the guards flanked her and guided her away, her white dress now looking less like a bridal gown and more like a shroud. All focus was now on Isabella. She was gasping her breaths, coming in shallow, ragged pants. The cramping was getting worse. "It hurts," she cried, clutching her belly as if she could physically hold her son in place. "Marcus, it hurts." Despite her flinching away, her fear-driven instinct was to call out to the man she still on some level saw as her protector. Marcus, his face ashen, knelt before her. "I'm here, Isabella. I'm so sorry. We'll get you to the hospital." He tried to take her hand, and this time she let him, her fingers gripping his with a desperate strength. The St. Regis staff, trained for any contingency, moved with quiet efficiency. A makeshift screen was erected around the table, affording the Thornes a sliver of privacy from the hundreds of prying eyes. A medic who was on standby for the event was at Isabella's side, in moments taking her pulse, his face grim. "Her blood pressure is dangerously high. She's cramping. We need to get her to a hospital immediately." "The FV hospital is the closest, with a top-tier maternity ward," the medic announced, referring to the well-regarded Franco-Vietnamese hospital in Ho Chi Minh City, which had a prestigious branch in Hanoi. The logistics of the escape were a blur to Isabella. She was vaguely aware of being transferred to a wheelchair, of being wheeled through service corridors and down a private elevator away from the whispers and the stares. The journey was a torment of pain and fear. Every bump in the road sent a fresh wave of agony through her. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, her hand never leaving her belly, whispering her son's name, a mantra against the encroaching darkness. Marcus sat beside her in the back of his Maybach, a silent, tormented figure. The mask of the powerful CEO was gone, replaced by the raw fear of a man watching his world crumble due to his own weakness. He kept murmuring apologies, a litany of, "I'm sorry, Isabella. I never wanted this. Please be okay." Isabella didn't respond. His words were meaningless static, the buzzing of a fly in a hurricane. The man whose promises had built her world had just stood by and watched it be demolished. His apologies were not for her. They were for himself. They were the desperate pleas of a guilty man, trying to absolve himself, and she had no comfort to offer him. She felt a terrifying wetness between her legs, and a fresh surge of panic rose in her throat. "Something's wrong," she gasped, her eyes flying open and locking with his. "Marcus, something is wrong with the baby." The terror in her voice finally seemed to penetrate his self-pity. He barked at his driver. "Faster. For God's sake, drive faster." As the limousine sped through the glittering, indifferent streets of Hanoi, leaving the scene of her humiliation far behind, Isabella felt a strange and chilling calm settle over her. The physical pain was immense, but it was the emotional agony that was truly defining. The slap had been a catalyst, a violent act that had shattered the gilded cage. But what echoed in its wake was not just the sound of a hand hitting skin, but the deafening silence of her husband's betrayal. It was the echo of a lie she had been living, a lie that was now threatening to cost her the only thing that mattered. She was no longer just fighting for her marriage or her dignity. She was fighting for her son's life. The emergency entrance of the FV hospital was a blur of harsh fluorescent lights and urgent controlled chaos. A team was waiting, alerted by Arthur Thorne's influential call. Isabella was swiftly transferred from the wheelchair to a gurney, the transition jarring her body and eliciting another cry of pain. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her, their voices a calm but urgent flurry of medical terminology. Pregnant, 26 weeks, presenting with severe abdominal cramping and signs of bleeding following a physical altercation. BP is 160/100. Tachycardic. Get her to the maternity ward, stat prep for an ultrasound. We need to check for placental abruption. Marcus was shunted to the side, rendered powerless and irrelevant by the medical professionals who now held his wife's and child's lives in their hands. He stood in the corridor, his tuxedo looking absurdly out of place, his hands stained with a small amount of Isabella's blood where he had tried to comfort her. He watched as they wheeled her away, her hand still protectively on her belly, her face pale and etched with fear. The doors swung shut behind her, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of his guilt. Inside the examination room, the atmosphere was tense. Isabella was gently helped into a hospital gown, her beautiful midnight blue dress unceremoniously cut away. The pain was a constant, terrifying rhythm. A kind-faced, middle-aged female doctor, Dr. Lien, introduced herself as the head of obstetrics. "Isabella, my name is Dr. Lien. We're going to take very good care of you and your baby," she said, her voice a beacon of calm in the storm. "We need to do an ultrasound to see what's happening. I need you to try and stay as still as possible." Isabella nodded, tears streaming silently down her temples. Is my baby going to be okay?" "We're doing everything we can to ensure that," Dr. Lien said, her reassuring tone never wavering, though her eyes betrayed the seriousness of the situation. "Let's have a look." The room fell silent as the ultrasound technician applied the cold gel to Isabella's stomach. All that could be heard was the soft whirring of the machine and Isabella's ragged breathing. She stared at the monitor, her heart pounding in her ears, praying for a sign, for a flicker of hope. The technician moved the transducer across her abdomen, the grey and black images swirling on the screen. Dr. Lien's eyes were narrowed in concentration, her brow furrowed. Marcus, who had finally been allowed in, after an agonizing wait, stood in the corner, looking on helplessly. "There's the baby," Dr. Lien said softly. He's small, but he's a fighter. Isabella let out a choked sob of relief. He was alive. But I am seeing some cause for concern. The doctor continued, her tone becoming more clinical. There appears to be a small subchorionic hematoma, likely caused by the trauma and the spike in your blood pressure. It's a bleed. That's what's causing the pain and the spotting. We need to monitor it very closely. But he'll be okay. Marcus's voice was hoarse from the sidelines. Dr. Lien didn't look at him. Her focus was entirely on her patient. The immediate danger is preterm labor. The stress and physical shock could trigger contractions. We're going to give you medication to stop them, and a steroid shot to help the baby's lungs develop, just in case. As she spoke, the technician adjusted a setting on the machine, and a new sound filled the room. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of the baby's heartbeat, amplified by the machine. It was fast, a frantic, galloping rhythm, but it was strong. It was the most beautiful sound Isabella had ever heard. Tears of relief streamed down her face. It was the sound of life, of hope. Dr. Lien smiled for the first time. A strong heartbeat. That's a very good sign. A little fast, he's clearly stressed, but strong. Marcus stepped forward, a wave of relief washing over his face. Thank God, he breathed. The technician continued her work, taking measurements, capturing stills of the tiny profile, the little fists. Dr. Lien was explaining the course of treatment, complete bed rest, constant monitoring, when the technician suddenly paused. She zoomed in on one particular area of the screen, her own brow furrowing in a way that had nothing to do with the hematoma. "Doctor," she said quietly, pointing to the screen. "Could you look at this?" Dr. Lien leaned in, her professional gaze sweeping over the area the technician indicated. The room fell silent again, the baby's amplified heartbeat the only sound. For a long moment, Dr. Lien said nothing. She simply stared at the image, her expression shifting from professional concern to one of utter bewilderment. "What is it?" Isabella asked, a fresh spike of fear piercing her relief. "Is something else wrong?" Dr. Lien turned from the monitor and looked at Isabella, then at Marcus, and then back to Isabella. Her face was a complex mask of confusion and something else, something that looked like disbelief. "Run the Doppler again," she instructed the technician. "Amplify it." The technician complied. The thump-thump sound filled the room once more. But this time the technician moved the transducer just a few centimeters, and then another sound joined the first. Thump-thump, 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 thump-thump. It was a second heartbeat. Distinct, separate, yet beating in an almost identical frantic rhythm. It was unmistakable. The room, which had been filled with one frantic heartbeat, was now filled with the sound of two. Isabella stared at the screen, then at the doctor, her mind unable to process the sound. "What is that?" Marcus stepped closer to the screen, his eyes wide with confusion. "Is that an echo? What's wrong with the machine?" Dr. Lien slowly shook her head, her eyes still locked on the monitor, where two tiny, flickering forms were now visible. She looked up at Isabella, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Thorne, there is nothing wrong with the machine." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself to announce something utterly impossible. "Isabella, you're not carrying one baby." She pointed a trembling finger at the screen, at the two distinct sacs, at the two tiny, flickering hearts, beating in terrified unison. You're having twins." The revelation hung in the air, a fact so stunning, so completely unexpected, that it defied all logic. All the previous scans conducted by a top society doctor chosen by Marcus had shown only one baby. One boy. The heir. Marcus had been there every time, beaming as he looked at the grainy image of his son. A wave of dizziness washed over Isabella. Twins. How was that possible? They had done scans at 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and the detailed anatomy scan at 20 weeks. All had shown one baby, a single, healthy boy. Then a darker, more insidious thought began to form in the recesses of her mind, born from the night's catastrophic betrayals. She looked at Marcus, whose face was not filled with the joy of an unexpected blessing, but with a ghostly pallor of pure, unadulterated shock. His expression was not one of confusion. It was the look of a man whose carefully constructed lie had just been blown apart by the most undeniable, most irrefutable truth of all. The society doctor, the man he had chosen, the insistence on it being a boy, the unwavering certainty. But all the other scans, she began, her voice trembling as the horrifying implication began to dawn on her. Dr. Pham always said, he said it was just one. Marcus couldn't meet her gaze. He stared at the screen at the 2 heartbeats that had just exposed him, his mind clearly racing, searching for an escape that didn't exist. And in that moment, Isabella understood. The slap, the affair, the public humiliation that was just the prelude. This was the true betrayal. It wasn't just a simple case of infidelity. It was a deception so profound, so calculated, that it had targeted the most sacred space in her life, her own body, her own children. Dr. Lyon, sensing the monumental shift in the room, spoke gently. Sometimes a twin can be hidden, tucked behind the other, especially if the sonographer isn't specifically looking. But at 26 weeks, it's unusual to miss. Very unusual. Her carefully chosen words hung in the air, a quiet indictment. The 2 heartbeats continued their frantic rhythmic drumming, a sound that was no longer just a sign of life, but a declaration of war. They were the beat of a truth that could not be silenced, a truth that revealed that Marcus Thorne had not just lied about his mistress. He had lied about the very nature of the legacy he claimed to cherish. Isabella was not just carrying his heir. She was carrying a secret he had desperately, and for reasons she couldn't yet fathom, tried to conceal. And now, thanks to the violent act of his mistress, that secret was out. Everything had changed. The revelation of the 2nd heartbeat did not bring joy. It detonated in the sterile hospital room like a silent, devastating bomb, obliterating the last vestiges of Isabella's shattered reality. The sound of the 2 tiny hearts beating in unison was a testament not to a miracle, but to a monstrous, calculated deception. Isabella lay on the hospital bed, the doctor's words echoing in her ears. "You're having twins." She looked at Marcus, truly looked at him for the first time since the news broke. The panic on his face was undeniable, but it was laced with something else, the cold, hard glint of a man cornered. It was the look of a king whose carefully constructed kingdom had just been set ablaze. You knew she whispered, her voice devoid of tears, stripped bare to a chilling monotone. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a verdict. You knew, and you lied. Marcus flinched, as if she had slapped him. "Isabella, no, how could I have known? It's a surprise, a blessing." His attempt at feigned delight was pathetic, a transparently false performance that was an insult to her intelligence. A blessing. Her voice rose, laced with a hysterical edge. You stood there at every appointment with Dr. Pham, your hand-picked physician, looking at the screen and telling me about our son, the Thorn heir. Was he in on it too? Did you pay him to lie, to erase one of our children from existence? The accusation hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Dr. Lyon and the technician suddenly became very busy averting their eyes, offering the illusion of privacy, where none existed. That's a crazy accusation, Marcus stammered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it for the first time all night. Why would I do that? Why would I hide one of my own children? I don't know. Isabella's voice cracked the raw pain finally breaking through her shock. Maybe one was a boy, and one was a girl, and you only wanted the boy. Maybe you have some sick, twisted reason. I can't even begin to imagine. But you knew. Your shock wasn't surprise, Marcus. It was the terror of being caught. The 2 heartbeats still thumping steadily from the monitor served as a relentless rhythmic jury. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. Guilty. Guilty. Before Marcus could formulate another lie, the door opened and his father, Arthur Thorn, swept in. The patriarch's face was a thundercloud of controlled rage. He had clearly been briefed. He took in the scene. Isabella pale and trembling with fury on the bed, Marcus cornered and sweating, the damning image still frozen on the ultrasound screen. Arthur's gaze fell on his son, and the disappointment in his eyes was so profound, it was almost a physical force. I have just had a very enlightening conversation with the hospital administrator, he said, his voice dangerously calm. And I took the liberty of placing a call to your Dr. Pham. A very nervous man, Dr. Pham. It seems his records from your last scan have been misplaced. Marcus visibly paled. The unspoken threat was clear. The Thorn family's reach was long, and a doctor who participated in such a fraud would have his career destroyed. Father, this is a misunderstanding. Marcus began, his voice pleading. Silence, Arthur commanded, and Marcus, for all his billions and his power, obeyed like a chastened child. Arthur walked to Isabella's bedside. His expression softened as he looked at her, a flicker of genuine compassion in his hardened eyes. Isabella, he said gently, I am profoundly sorry for the humiliation you suffered tonight, and for this unforgivable deception. Whatever my son has done, the Thorn family will not abandon you or your children. He glanced at the monitor, a flicker of wonder crossing his face at the sight of the 2 distinct forms, 2 potential heirs. He then turned his full attention back to Marcus, his voice dropping to a low growl. You will tell me why. You will tell me why you would deny your own blood. Now. Trapped between his furious father and his devastated wife, Marcus finally broke. The lies, the bravado, the carefully maintained facade, it all crumbled. He slumped into the chair in the corner, his head in his hands. It was complicated, he mumbled. Complicated does not suffice when you are lying to your wife about the existence of your child, Arthur thundered. Marcus looked up, his face a mask of desperation. It was Camilla, he said, his voice barely a whisper. She's pregnant too. The air was sucked out of the room. Isabella felt a fresh wave of nausea so intense she thought she would be sick. It was a betrayal on a scale she could never have conceived. I found out a few months ago Marcus continued the confession, tumbling out of him in a torrent of self-pitying misery. She claimed it was mine. She threatened to go public to ruin everything. The anniversary, the launch of the new subsidiary. The timing was a disaster. She wanted me to leave you to marry her. She was obsessed. And your solution was to lie to everyone, Arthur demanded. I was buying time. Marcus insisted, standing up, pacing like a caged animal. I didn't know if her baby was even mine. I told her I'd handle it. My plan, my stupid, idiotic plan, was to secure the legitimate heir. Our son. He looked at Isabella. I needed to establish his primacy. A single male heir. It was clean, powerful. It would cement our family line and make Camilla's claim if she made it seem like a desperate, pathetic ploy from a scorned mistress. The chilling logic of his plan began to dawn on Isabella. And a second baby, a twin. Complicated, that she said, her voice hollow. It muddied the waters, he exclaimed, almost angry that she was making him admit it. 2 babies. It made it seem messy, less definitive. And what if one was a girl? It would weaken my position. I told Fam to just focus on the boy, to omit the other one from the official reports, just for a little while. I was going to reveal the surprise twin later after Camilla's situation was neutralized. I swear it, Isabella. I would never have denied our child forever. It was a temporary strategic deception. A strategic deception. Isabella repeated the words, tasting their poison. You erased our child from our lives for strategy. You made me believe I was only carrying one baby, grieving a loss. I didn't even know I had all to manage your sordid affair. The sheer cold-blooded calculus of it was breathtaking. He had weighed his children on a scale of public relations and corporate strategy and found one of them wanting. He hadn't just cheated on her. He had played God with their unborn children. Arthur Thorne looked at his son with utter contempt. You are a fool, Marcus. A weak, short-sighted fool. You have taken a crisis and turned it into a cataclysm. You have dishonored your wife, your name, and your own unborn children, all to appease a venomous viper you were too weak to discard. He turned back to Isabella, his decision made. Isabella, you will want for nothing. The full resources of the Thorne family are at your disposal. You and your children will be protected. As for you, Marcus, he said, his voice dropping to absolute 0. You are relieved of all your duties at Thorne Corporation, effective immediately. Your assets are frozen. You will go to the country house, and you will not leave until I summon you. You have made your bed of lies. Now you will lie in it. Alone. The verdict was absolute. In the space of a few hours, Marcus Thorne had gone from the king of Hanoi's business world to a dethroned, disgraced exile. He stared at his father, then at his wife, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. There was nothing left to say. His lies had unraveled, and in doing so had unraveled him completely. Isabella watched him, feeling not a shred of pity, only a vast, empty coldness where her love used to be. The man she had married was a stranger, a moral void hidden behind a handsome face and a charming smile. The trauma of the night, the slap the terror had forged something new inside her. The meek, trusting art curator was gone. In her place was a mother of 2, a woman who had been pushed to the absolute limit and had found not an abyss but a core of steel. The 2 heartbeats on the monitor continued their steady, strong rhythm. They were the only truth left in the room. They were her truth. And she would protect them and herself with a ferocity that Marcus and his mistress could not possibly comprehend. The war was just beginning. The week that followed was a cocoon of enforced tranquility and simmering rage. Isabella remained at the FV hospital, not just for medical reasons, but for sanctuary. Her suite was transformed into a command center, a fortress from which she would plan her counter-offensive. The hematoma was stable, the risk of preterm labor had subsided, and the 2 tiny heartbeats that had upended her world grew stronger each day. They were her fuel, her purpose. Arthur Thorne was true to his word. He visited daily, not with the overbearing authority of a patriarch, but with the quiet deference of an ally. He saw in Isabella not a fragile victim, but the future matriarch of his legacy, the guardian of not 1 but 2 of his grandchildren. He provided her with the best legal team in Vietnam, a group of sharp, merciless lawyers who specialized in high-stakes divorces. Spare no expense, Arthur had told them in Isabella's presence. I want this handled with the subtlety of a guillotine, clean, final, and entirely in Ms. Isabella's favor. Marcus was gone, banished to a remote Thorne estate in the highlands of Dalat. His name was scrubbed from the corporate website his office cleared out. The official story, meticulously crafted by Arthur's PR team, was that Marcus had stepped down for personal health reasons to focus on his family during a difficult pregnancy. The story was just plausible enough to quell the rampant speculation. But the real story, the one whispered in the boardrooms and elite social circles, was that the king had been ruthlessly deposed. Camilla Tran was also dealt with. Arthur's investigators had worked with surgical precision. They uncovered her own web of debts and deceit. The pregnancy, she claimed, it was real. But a discreetly obtained DNA test from a coffee cup she'd used at a cafe proved what Arthur had suspected: the baby wasn't Marcus's. It belonged to a married Singaporean businessman she had been seeing concurrently. Armed with this proof, Arthur's lawyers presented her with a simple, non-negotiable choice: disappear quietly, with a modest one-time settlement and a signed NDA, or face public exposure fraud charges and the unmitigated wrath of the Thorne family. Camilla, a pragmatist above all else, took the deal and vanished from the Hanoi social scene as quickly as she had appeared. But for Isabella, these victories were peripheral. Her focus was singular. It wasn't about revenge on Camilla, or even about punishing Marcus anymore. It was about reclaiming her narrative and securing an unassailable future for her children. During her days in the hospital, she began to change. The soft, deferential woman who had once organized art exhibitions was replaced by a shrewd, calculating strategist. She devoured the financial reports her lawyers brought her, learning about trust funds, share allocations, and corporate governance. She had once loved Marcus for his charm and ambition. Now she studied the architecture of the empire he had built, not with admiration, but with the critical eye of a conqueror. Her gambit, when she finally revealed it to her lawyers and a stunned but impressed Arthur Thorne, was audacious. "I don't want a simple divorce settlement," she announced one afternoon, her voice clear and steady. The hospital suite was bathed in the soft afternoon light, and she was propped up in bed, surrounded by financial documents looking more like a CEO than a patient. "I don't want cash or property or alimony." Her lead lawyer, a formidable woman named Ms. Vi, raised an eyebrow. "Ms. Isabella, given the circumstances, the infidelity, the public assault, the staggering fraud regarding the children, you are entitled to one of the largest settlements in this country's history." "A settlement makes me a pensioner of the Thorne family," Isabella stated calmly. "It makes me a wealthy victim. I have no interest in being a victim." She looked directly at Arthur. Marcus's shares in Thorn Corporation, his voting rights, his seat on the board. I want them transferred to a trust that I control as the sole trustee for the benefit of my children. Arthur stared at her, his expression unreadable. Ms. Vi's jaw practically dropped. Isabella was not asking for a piece of the pie. She was demanding control of the bakery. He will never agree to that, Ms. Vi said. That's his identity, his life's work. He will agree, Isabella said with chilling certainty. Because the alternative is that I don't sign a non-disclosure agreement. The alternative is that I give a full exclusive interview to the Wall Street Journal. I will tell them everything about the affair, about the public assault by his mistress, and about the meticulous, medically assisted fraud he perpetrated to hide the existence of one of his own children for strategic gain. She let the threat hang in the air. It was mutually assured destruction. The scandal would not just destroy Marcus's reputation permanently. It would taint the Thorn Corporation name for a generation. It would cause shareholder panic, invite regulatory scrutiny, and become a legendary case study in corporate malfeasance and moral bankruptcy. I will detail how Dr. Pham was pressured to falsify medical records. She continued, her eyes locked on Arthur. I will explain that my husband's immediate reaction to discovering he was having twins was not joy, but terror at his lie being exposed. I will paint a picture of a man and a corporate culture so obsessed with a clean, powerful narrative of a single male heir that it was willing to deny a child's very existence. Arthur remained silent, his steepled fingers covering his mouth. He was a ruthless businessman, and he recognized the move for what it was, a brilliant, perfectly executed checkmate. Isabella had found his single greatest weakness, his obsession with the family legacy. She was using the sanctity of that legacy which Marcus had so carelessly desecrated as her ultimate weapon. She wasn't threatening to take his money. She was threatening to burn his kingdom to the ground. Finally, he spoke, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated respect. He'll sign, Arthur said, nodding to Ms. Vi. Draw up the papers. The meeting with Marcus was arranged a week later, after Isabella was discharged and settled into a new, secure penthouse, one chosen and paid for by her from an advance on the trust. The location was neutral, a private conference room at the Sofitel Legend Metropole, Hanoi, a place of old-world power. Isabella walked in, not as a victim, but as an equal. She was no longer pregnant and hiding behind flowing dresses. She had given birth 2 days prior to 2 small but healthy babies, a boy, Leo, and a girl, Luna. The birth had been premature but uncomplicated. Her body was tired, but her spirit was forged in iron. Marcus was already there, flanked by his own lawyer. He looked diminished, a ghost of his former self. The tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, and the arrogance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. He hadn't seen Isabella or his children since the night at the hospital. He stood when she entered. Isabella, I heard about the babies. Are they? They are fine, she said, her voice cool and professional, cutting him off. She did not take the offered seat across from him, but remained standing, a silent assertion of power. No thanks to you. She gestured for Ms. Vi to present the documents. Marcus's lawyer read through them, his eyes widening with each clause. He leaned over and whispered frantically to his client. Marcus just shook his head, a broken man. This is everything, he whispered, looking at Isabella. My shares, my seat, my entire life. You have a life, Isabella retorted, her voice sharp as glass. You have one because I am choosing not to scorch the earth. I am choosing to protect the family name for the sake of my children. This is not a punishment, Marcus. It is a consequence. You proved you are not fit to be the steward of this legacy. So now I will be. She finally sat down, her gaze unwavering. You will have supervised visitation rights. You will be provided with a generous allowance enough to live comfortably, but not enough to cause trouble. You will, for all intents and purposes, retire from public life. In return, the world will remember you as the man who stepped down for his family. It's a better legacy than the one you were building. You should thank me. There was a long, heavy silence. Marcus looked at the documents, then at his ex-wife, the woman he had so grievously underestimated. He saw not the gentle girl he had married, but an empress in the making. He had created her, in a way. His betrayals had been the fire, and she had walked out of it, reborn, holding his entire world in her hands. With a trembling hand, Marcus Thorne, the deposed king, picked up the pen. He signed away his power, his company, and his future, all to the steady, silent rhythm of two tiny heartbeats he had once tried to erase. The Empress's gambit had succeeded, and so the story of the slap that shocked Hanoi's elite took its final, stunning turn. It was never just about a mistress's fury or a husband's infidelity. It was about a deception that ran to the very heart of a family, and the quiet, unassuming wife who rose from the ashes of public humiliation to seize control of an empire. Isabella Thorne, once a footnote in her husband's story, became the author of her own, rewriting her destiny. Not with tears, but with shrewd intelligence and the unyielding power of a mother's love. She proved that the greatest strength is often forged in the deepest betrayal, and that sometimes the most powerful move is not to destroy your enemies, but to simply take everything they hold dear. What did you think of Isabella's ultimate power move? Was it justice or the most brilliant revenge? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.